Royals like Princess Diana had some infamous marriages, but nothing compares to the nightmare Caroline of Brunswick had to endure. From literally the very beginning of her union with the rakish King George IV, her life turned into a soap opera, and the drama only stopped with her tragic, jaw-dropping end. The moment Caroline of Brunswick gave birth to a daughter, her husband King George IV changed his last will and testament, leaving her a truly disturbing gift. On the surface, Caroline was as spoiled a brat as they come. Her father Charles William was the Duke of Brunswick, while her mother Princess Augusta was the sister to the current King of England, George III. They were the perfect image of royalty, but when you took a closer look, her family was utterly twisted. Despite her fairy tale background, Caroline's home life was nightmarish. Her father and mother despised each other, mostly because her dear old dad liked flaunting his chief mistress around the palace. Caroline didn't escape unscathed either. She later confessed that she felt like a shuttlecock between her parents, and that whenever she was nice to one, the other would get angry at her. Yet the dysfunction did not stop there. As Caroline grew up, people couldn't fail to notice her show-stopping good looks, but she also had charm to spare. Still, while most girls would rejoice at skipping the awkward stage, this actually was really bad news for Caroline. The more Caroline grew into her looks, the more her parents grew frantic that their high society daughter would get into major trouble with men. Instead of tamping down their paranoia, they did everything they could to keep Caroline away from the opposite sex. Caroline's parents had some severe trust issues. Her parents did rarely let Caroline attend public functions like balls. But there was a major catch. Caroline wasn't even allowed to dance at these events and had to go sit at a card table with old ladies the moment the band struck the first chord. Caroline did not react well to her parents' smothering, which is pretty understandable. It's just that her rebellion was utterly bizarre. After her family refused to let her go to yet another ball, Caroline finally had enough and put a plan into action. After her parents left to go to the function themselves, Caroline faked a violent illness that forced them to come back and see her. When they arrived, they received horrific news. When her mother and father rushed back home, the girl didn't simulate a measly little flu or a free case of the chickenpox. Nope, she went the whole 9 yards. Not only did she insist that she was pregnant, but she also said that she was going into labor right then and there. This did not end well. Completely fooled, Caroline's parents rushed out and brought a midwife to her bedside. That's when Caroline completed her revenge. As soon as the midwife entered her room, Caroline suddenly dropped her facade and asked her mother, "Now, madam, will you keep me another time from a ball?" Caroline may have had a ridiculously strict upbringing, but she was still a beautiful, wealthy aristocrat, and she had barely turned 13 before her parents started casting about for an eligible suitor. She received scads of proposals from English and Prussian princes, but none of them seemed to stick, and there might have been a scandalous reason for her many flings. Later on in her life, Caroline confessed an enormous secret. She claimed that during this royal speed dating period, she was actually in love with an anonymous, low-born man known only as the Handsome Irishman. Tragically, she had begged her father to allow her to marry him despite his low status, and the domineering patriarch refused point blank. Then again, an even more shocking rumor emerged from this time. Though no sources can substantiate the claims, there were a lot of whispers that as a young teenager, Caroline got pregnant, for real this time, and had even given birth. There were many theories about the identity of this supposed father, with some believing it was this handsome Irishman, and others claiming it was a peasant from one of the houses Caroline often visited. Whatever the truth was, the entire situation had big consequences. These pregnancy rumors were so rampant, they were practically common knowledge at a certain point. Some people argued that it was this sordid past that kept the otherwise eligible bachelorette single for so long. By the time Caroline turned 26, she was already considered an old maid by the day's standards. And her family began to wonder if her time had passed, until one fateful day. The Brunswicks were beside themselves about their daughter's fate, and they tried one last desperate move. They opened up marriage talks with Caroline's cousin, the future King George IV of England. At this point, George was Britain's Prince of Wales, and one of the most sought-after royals in Europe. So how did the tarnished Caroline of Brunswick bag him? Well, the answer to that is super gross. In truth, George and Caroline had the opposite of a fairy tale. George was messy, rakish, and most importantly, so deeply in debt that Parliament staunchly refused to increase his allowance unless he married an eligible European princess. Enter Caroline of Brunswick. That's right, she was nothing more than a cash cow to George. And the drama doesn't end there. In 1794, Prince George and Caroline of Brunswick were officially engaged before ever having met each other. But the whole time, George was hiding a ruinous secret. He was already married. In 1785, he married his longtime mistress, Maria Fitzherbert. Although Parliament refused to recognize their union because of Fitzherbert's lower social class. In March 1795, Caroline traveled to meet her Prince Charming. But it was not an auspicious beginning. For one, Caroline didn't make a good impression on the way over. Her British guide, Lord Malmesbury, balked at Caroline's brassy, outspoken nature. He also noted the princess's lack of hygiene. But if someone in the 18th century thinks you're dirty, you're dirty. Caroline's first encounter with Prince George shattered any illusions she might have had about a fairy tale romance. After all, George was notorious for loving women, cards, and big meals. Once she saw the prince, Caroline would go on to say that he was very fat and that he's nothing like as handsome as his portrait. Reportedly, George took one look at Caroline and dealt her an ice-cold insult. Without saying much of anything to her, he turned to his manservant and asked for a glass of brandy, presumably to wash down his disappointment with his bride-to-be. Yet, it wasn't exactly love at first sight for these two. But the night had further indignities ahead. It didn't take long for Caroline to realize that her groom had a cruel streak in him the size of his well-fed girth. In fact, the woman Prince George had sent ahead to become Caroline's lady of the bedchamber was none other than his current mistress, Princess Villiers. Unsurprisingly, the headstrong Caroline didn't handle that well. All in all, the marriage had a completely disastrous start. Yet somehow, the downhill slide would only gain speed. Those 18th century royals moved fast, and George and Caroline headed for the altar just 3 days after their absurdly dysfunctional first meeting. That's when George really took it up a notch. Figuring the whole first impressions portion of the courtship was a wash anyway, he was absolutely drunk at his own wedding ceremony and apparently also deemed Caroline too unhygienic to be attractive. Then came the infamous wedding night. In an ensuing letter to his friend, George revealed all the gory details of his first night as Caroline's husband, and they were even worse than you would expect. He claimed that throughout the entire marriage, he and Caroline only had intimate relations a bare 3 times, twice on the wedding night and once the day after. As for how those lucky 3 times went, well, by the time Caroline hit the marriage bed with her new royal husband, their dislike for each other had curled into bitter hatred. For his part, George claimed that it, quote, required no small effort to conquer his aversion and overcome the disgust of her person. Caroline recalled that George was so in his cups, he, quote, passed the greatest part of his bridal night under the grate, where he fell and where I left him. But even after this gong show of a wedding night, things still managed to get worse for the newlyweds. Just a few months after her wedding, Caroline made a horrific discovery. Well, horrific if you hate your husband. She was pregnant. Apparently 3 times is all it took, and she gave birth to Princess Charlotte on January 7th, 1796, almost exactly 9 months to the day of her wedding night. Still, on the bright side, you'd think giving George an heir would make Caroline's life easier. But you'd be wrong. According to reports from the time, George didn't just hate Caroline, he also tried to control her every move in increasingly humiliating ways. Princess Villiers, who was still both George's mistress and Caroline's lady of the bedchamber, reportedly snooped through Caroline's private letters, using the information to gain advantages over the poor girl. In a tragic echo of her supremely unhappy childhood, the newspapers claimed that George refused to allow Caroline to go anywhere without his express permission, whether it was visiting friends or traveling abroad. So just like that, the vibrant Caroline of Brunswick was back to living in a gilded cage. But no bad deed goes unpunished. Although Caroline had to endure the worst of her husband's contempt, it backfired right in his face. While the public rightly thought George was a huge lush with an even bigger spending problem, they adored Caroline's open manners and her, quote, winning familiarity. She soon became incredibly popular with the people, and George didn't like her newfound fame one bit. If there was one thing Prince George lived for besides his nightcaps, it was the adoration of his underlings, so he did not take kindly to the idea that his hated wife, Caroline, was the darling of the British people, and that he was the butt of their jokes. His jealousy consumed him day in and day out, and it wasn't long before it hit a breaking point. In April 1796, the bottom finally dropped out of Caroline's fairy tale. George admitted in writing that they were both deeply unhappy and asked that they separate. The next year, Caroline broke from her chains almost entirely and started residing in a private estate. As soon as Caroline got away from George, dark rumors began to swirl. Many people whispered that in the privacy of her new home, Caroline was getting up to some very intimate acts. They claimed that she continually entertained a series of handsome men, including the dashing soldiers Sir Sidney Smith and Captain Thomas Monby. Caroline was finally turning into the bad girl that she was born to be, and she wasn't stopping anytime soon. In addition to flirting with all the men in her radius, Caroline also developed a new quirk. She started collecting an assortment of children, adopting a brood of 8 or 9 toddlers, and doling them out to be fostered by various families in her district. In 1802, she even took a little boy named William Austin into her own house. But this was a very, very bad idea. During this stage, the noblewoman also mercilessly started feuds with her well-to-do neighbors, the aristocrats Sir John and Lady Douglas. They claimed that the princess loved to send them obscene and harassing letters whenever she could. To her dismay, Caroline quickly found out that she had made the exact wrong enemies. Sir John and Lady Douglas were able to do a lot of spying on Caroline's private quarters. Soon, they got their revenge by revealing the skeletons lurking in Caroline's closet. In retaliation, Lady Douglas ran to the government and claimed that Caroline had been carrying on affairs. The bitter neighbor even asserted that the future queen had once confessed that she was pregnant and that her adopted son William Austin was really her illegitimate child. With these accusations, the ministers only had one option, and it wasn't pretty. Agape at the enormity of Caroline's supposed scandals, the Prime Minister himself gathered a cadre of men and set up a secret snoop operation into her private life, calling it, quote, the Delicate Investigation. Well, despite its name, its methods were anything but delicate. They dug into every accusation around Caroline's lovers and lifestyle, interviewing countless members of her household. The findings were more than surprising. After questioning Caroline's servants, the Prime Minister grew to believe that Caroline had been inappropriately flirtatious with men, but at the same time, no one could prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that she had carried on an affair with any of her male companions. They soon dropped the inquest, but it was too little too late. The damage was done. Prince George was always trying to find new ways to stick it to his estranged wife. So during this delicate investigation, he kept Caroline far away from their daughter Charlotte. Afterward, this cruelty became tragedy. George restricted Caroline's visits to Charlotte to a mere once a week. After years of a chilly détente, Caroline and George ignited their feud, and it reached an entirely new level. Suddenly, all of England was split between Team George and Team Caroline, with the two royals going back and forth at each other through various propaganda campaigns. And George really knew how to play dirty. Not only did he leak some of the information from the delicate investigation, but he also regularly barred Caroline from attending the best parties of the day. But Caroline knew how to fight back. While George had the highest society on his side, Caroline still had support where it mattered. Her own daughter, Charlotte, who could plainly see that her dad was a megalomaniacal loser, picked her mom in the split. Even the famous author Jane Austen once wrote, "Poor woman, I shall support her as long as I can, because she is a woman, and because I hate her husband." By the summer of 1814, Caroline hit a crisis. Fed up with facing off against her powerful husband, she escaped into a genteel exile and started jaunting through Europe's hotspots and beyond. She visited Switzerland and Italy, as well as Constantinople and Nazareth. But since this is Caroline of Brunswick we're talking about, she did not go without drama. While gallivanting around, Caroline picked up a new male favorite, the handsome Italian Bartolomeo Pergami. He started out as her servant, but quickly became the head of the entire household and entourage. The pair grew very close, taking their meals together and traveling everywhere side by side. So it wasn't long before some very convincing rumors started circulating. Just about everyone thought that Pergami and Caroline were romantically involved, despite the fact that both of them were married to other people. Caroline had just been in hot water back in England over rumors of adultery, so perhaps she should have been a little more discreet. During their sojourns, Pergami traveled with practically everyone in his family, including his brother, mother, and daughter. The only person missing was his wife. Then there's this little tidbit. While out east, Caroline instituted the Order of Caroline and nominated Pergami as its Grand Master. But from great scandal, Caroline soon moved to utter heartache. In November 1817, an unimaginable tragedy hit the royal family. Princess Charlotte, who had just gotten married to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, perished while giving birth to a stillborn son. In the blink of an eye, George and Caroline lost their beloved child and their royal line, and Caroline's grief turned into a profound sense of betrayal. Caroline was utterly devastated when she found out about her daughter's end, but it was how she found out that was truly tragic. George refused to write to his wife and tell her that their only daughter was gone from this world. Instead, he left the duty to Prince Leopold, who delayed writing it because he was in mourning. The results of this were barbarous. Even though George didn't bother to inform Caroline, he did send a letter to the Pope letting him know. Completely by chance, the courier carrying this letter passed by where Caroline was living and tried to offer her his condolences. This meant that Caroline learned about her only child's death from a random courier. Unfortunately for Caroline, losing Princess Charlotte meant that she lost another incredibly important thing: any hope of regaining her influence at court. She was no longer the mother of the heiress to England, which left her more vulnerable to George's incessant attacks on her character, her independence, and her livelihood. In 1820, George's father had passed away, making him King George IV of England, and Caroline of Brunswick, at least technically, into Queen Caroline. This kicked their catastrophic marriage into overdrive. Unable to just sit back and enjoy his kingship, George was demonically bent on keeping Caroline from a crown, even going so far as to have the clerics remove her name from the liturgy in the Church of England. With the news that her husband was now king, the still exiled Caroline started to inch closer and closer to an English homecoming, much to the panic of George's ministers. They were so sure that total war would break out if Caroline set foot on the cliffs of Dover. They agreed to pay her an extra £50,000 a year to stay far away. But did Caroline listen? Nope. But should she have? 100% yes. On June 5th, 1820, Caroline said "screw you" to her haters and landed in England anyway. The moment she did, it was utter pandemonium. Riots broke out in support of the spurned queen and against King George's conservative reputation, leading Caroline to become a surprising figurehead for radical political reform. The very day after Caroline landed in England, George took 2 green bags over to Parliament and plopped them down in front of the benches. Their contents were absolutely scandalous. It was all the evidence he had been sitting on from his Milan Commission, and the peers considered them convincing enough to launch a public trial against Caroline. Suddenly, years of George's machinations were coming to fruition. From the start, the trial against Caroline looked bad, and to make matters worse, the scandal caused an absolute frenzy in the press. Witnesses claimed that Caroline and Pergami slept in the same bed, kissed in public, and were often around each other half-dressed. So it seemed like they were definitely lovers. After hearing the testimony, the House of Lords passed a bill that would strip Caroline of her title and dissolve her marriage. Only, if you think that's the end, not so fast. By this point, King George IV was probably breaking out a celebratory drink or 8, but fate had other plans in store. In the end, the bill could only be a symbolic gesture. Caroline was far too popular in the House of Commons, so the pernicious edict never even went beyond the House of Lords. On July 19, 1821, King George IV finally had his official coronation, and Caroline came one step closer to her tragic end. Bolstered by her popularity with the masses and her victory over her trial, she pushed to attend the royal coronation even though George had expressly forbid her. But this idea backfired hard. The minute Caroline rode up to the ceremony at Westminster, she suffered an embarrassment so total it has lived in infamy ever since. She strutted toward the front doors of the building, but King George was ready for her. His men fulfilled his orders and humiliatingly turned Caroline away. Instead of taking her lumps and going home, Caroline simply couldn't admit defeat in the face of her husband's cruelty. She scurried away from the front doors and tried to get in through the doors on the east cloister next. No luck. Then the west cloister. Still no luck. Increasingly frantic, Caroline went to Westminster Hall in full view of the arriving guests. In the coming seconds, England's glitterati witnessed a jaw-dropping sight. According to one eyewitness, when Caroline reached the Westminster Hall entrance, men posted up at the door and had the audacity to put a bayonet up to the chin of the Queen of freaking England. They were fully ready to turn her away, if not by persuasion, then by force. To top it all off, a chamberlain then slammed the doors in Caroline's face. Sadly though, this train wreck was in full swing, and Caroline had one last humiliation in store. She now tried to sneak in through the famous Poets' Corner in Westminster, only to have yet another of King George's lackeys head her off at the pass. At long last, the man convinced Caroline that what she was doing was complete madness, and sent her back to her carriage. Yet dark consequences were ahead. Her unhinged and undignified display at George's coronation made her popularity with the people plummet instantly, and crowds even jeered her as she rode out of the coronation site with her tail between her legs. By the time the sun set, she had fallen seriously ill. To ease her suffering, Caroline took some milk of magnesia, as well as some drops of laudanum, hoping to sleep it off and come back swinging in the morning. But like so much else in her life, this did not go according to plan. A few weeks passed, and Caroline came to a terrifying conclusion. Her condition and ill health were not getting any better. On the contrary, she realized that she was nearing the end of her life. Without time to think, she began to organize her affairs for when she passed. Throughout her illness, Caroline frequently said that she thought that she had been poisoned, and, given the suspicious timing of her sickness, many people began to whisper that King George IV was the one who had orchestrated the chilling act. After all, what could be better for him than conveniently getting rid of his pesky wife? Historians, however, have come to an entirely different conclusion. While Caroline's own doctors believed that she had an intestinal obstruction that was wreaking havoc on her body, modern experts today think she could have been suffering from some kind of cancer that decided to rear its ugly head in the middle of her mental anguish. Well, whatever the truth, Caroline's end was nothing short of heartbreaking. On August 7th, only weeks after her humiliating display at Westminster, Caroline of Brunswick passed in her residence at 10:25 p.m. The Queen of England was only 53 years old at the time of her passing, yet she somehow managed to stuff 3 lifetimes worth of intrigue into her short time on Earth. And that's not all. As if to cement her scandal maker reputation, Caroline managed to start some drama from beyond the grave. Before she went, she burned up all her memoirs, notebooks, and letters, ensuring that King George IV couldn't ever get a hold of any of her best-kept secrets and besmirch her name. Caroline planned every last detail of her funeral like the total boss she was, and these plans included an utterly iconic request for the inscription on her tomb. She had it inscribed, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England," just to ensure that King George could never forget what an enormous donkey he was. And the dearly departed Queen managed to cause one last riot. On the day of her funeral, George's ministers, fearing unrest among Caroline's mourners, decided to reroute her procession. Well, this only made the crowd even angrier. Chaos broke out in the streets, with commoners throwing bricks at the honor guard and 2 civilians perishing in the fray. Sure, it was not exactly healthy mourning, but it was dramatic. As ridiculous as Caroline of Brunswick's story is today, it was magnified during her own time. The royal infighting between George and his wife was on the tongues of everyone in the United Kingdom, with the critic William Hazlitt once writing, "It struck its root into the heart of the nation. It took possession of every house or cottage in the kingdom." George and Caroline's relationship was full of drama, betrayal, pettiness, and revenge, but nothing beats this little piece of cruelty. Once Caroline's daughter, Princess Charlotte, was born, George immediately changed his last will and testament, and he left his royal wife a disturbing gift. Not 3 days after Princess Charlotte came into the world, George updated his will and gave all his possessions to Maria Fitzherbert, my wife, or so he signed, just to really drive the point home to Caroline about who mattered most to him. Meanwhile, George left Caroline 1 single shilling. Caroline, in the end, this guy deserved everything he got. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.